All right, chapter 16. This deals with epidemiology. So epidemiology is a field that looks into the geographical distribution and timing of infectious diseases occurrences, how they are transmitted and maintained in nature. Epidemiologists basically want to learn about diseases as they arise, as they are emerging, as they're changing, as they're moving through, the different populations. And of course, their goal is to be able to stop any infections, any outbreaks, and keep the diseases at bay, figure out how to control them, right? Epidemiologists want to look at the etiology. So this term means the cause of the disease. So what causes it? Is it bacteria? Is it a virus? Is it a protist? And they want to investigate how it's transmitted between people. Is it spread through the air? Is it fecal oral? Is it something that you get through blood or is it something you get through saliva? So again, for the goal of stopping any progression of the disease. And so we want to know these words, right? We know incidence and prevalence. These are related. They're basically the number of new cases over a certain period of time. So you can talk about the incidence of measles over the past year. You can talk about the incidence of HIV over the past 10 years compared to the general healthy population. And then prevalence is just the total number. So basically the difference is new cases that arise versus the total number of existing cases. So I have a picture. I think this is the prevalence and incidence of HIV. And you can see that in red, we have people with HIV infections, right? So if we start off in 1980, we can see a huge upward swing where it was a big issue. It plateaus around the time where we get awareness about HIV. We're finding drugs against HIV. And then over time, it's still going up. And so that's the that's the prevalence, right? So how many total HIV infections do we have? And it makes sense that we're adding, right? Because HIV is a chronic disease. So chronic diseases, once that you have it and it stays with you for years or for life, right? Once you get it, you're put into the prevalence count. So as people get it over the years, right? These are new infections. New infections are not zero, but they're low. So we can see that we're adding these new infections to the existing infections. So the prevalence is always going to be really high for chronic diseases, right? Chronic versus something where the incidence, right? The incidence is relatively low. That's just how many new ones are, new infections year over year. If this were a very acute infection, something you get, it goes away, and people usually clear it, then you could expect maybe the prevalence and the incidence to be around the same, because once you get it, you're an incident, but then you go away from the prevalence count, right? Because you don't have it anymore. So chronic infections will oftentimes look like this. Coming back to the other two terms, mortality and morbidity. Mortality is the deaths in a population due to a certain disease, and morbidity is basically people afflicted. So they don't die from it, but maybe they're sick from it, or they have some kind of underlying immunocompromised state from it. So people who are suffering from the disease is morbidity rate, and then mortality is people who die. In this, this is looking at the mortality rate of the flu. So the flu does kill people, as you can see in this chart. Usually they do it per 100,000 of a population. So this is the rate. And we have clearly the older population is more susceptible to die from a flu infection, which is really important to get your older adults in your life vaccinated. And even, when they're older, we will talk about how T cells wane over the years. Your immune system just doesn't become as active over the years. So since vaccinations depend on your immune system to react to the vaccine, vaccinations are not really that helpful. I mean, they should get vaccinated just to have any protection. But so what I'm trying to say is for people who are older, you want to make sure they stay away from people that are sick. Stay away, wear a mask if you're feeling bad, because you could pass on the flu to someone who doesn't have a good immune system. Excuse me. And the very young, but normally in your healthy years, you're good, have a little bit more incidence here at 50 to 64. Mortality rate. So these are some other definitions you want to know. I did make a little matching, so if you want to stop it and try this yourself, you can. But these diseases, sporadic means like every once in a while you'll have a little pop-up of the disease. Endemic, right? So what matches that? Occurs occasionally, letter D. Endemic means that it's present all the time. Any time of year, we can talk about the endemic diseases of India versus the endemic diseases of the United States or France or Asia. So they're going to be different for different areas of the world. So endemic diseases are constantly present. Epidemic diseases are going to be infecting a lot of people at once in a short amount of time. And we didn't talk about, but we all lived through COVID. COVID was actually a pandemic, right? Because it was an epidemic worldwide. So pandemic means that it is a worldwide disease with many people affected. So that's going to be A. And in terms of our examples down here, the cold, cholera, amoebic dysentery, and COVID, we already mentioned COVID was our pandemic. Okay. The cold is going to be endemic. So you can get the cold anytime. Oops, that's number one. Then we have cholera and amoebic dysentery. So cholera is something that's spread very quickly through a population, and a lot of people get it at one time because it's easily passed. So number two would be an epidemic disease. And this is a picture of basically a cholera epidemic. And what they do is they set up these cots for people who have cholera. And you can't see very clearly, but the cots will have a cutout, right? So in this picture here, where you have a mother and child, you can see that there is a bucket underneath the cot. And so there's a hole here. And if you needed, people are so weak from cholera, they can't get up and use the bathroom. Also, after a certain amount of time, it's basically just all water that's coming out. We'll talk about cholera in the future in class, but it's really just a loss of so many fluids. So it's almost clear water. And so they basically has this to catch that water. And so you can see another bucket here. So those are called cholera cots. And lastly, we have amoebic dysentery. This is very sporadic. Usually you hear about outbreaks of this every once in a while on like a cruise ship or people. Let's just leave it on a cruise ship. All right. Okay, so etiology, right? The cause of the disease. So we want to connect. So let's say there's a new disease, like when HIV first came to our conscious awareness, right? It was a new disease. People did not know what caused it, right? So they had to look into the cause, and linking something to a direct causation is kind of difficult because diseases can manifest in different ways. If you look at this chart, you have the the disease, right? And it can be this these are all variables to how the disease is going to present, right? So you need the agent, the vector. Sometimes you can get a weak, not very virulent form. Let's say it's a virus, not very virulent form of the virus, the host, or a very virulent form of the virus. You can have a host that is immunocompromised. Maybe the host is older. Maybe the host is a baby. Maybe the host is a perfectly healthy, person. So the immune system of the host, the genetics of the host plays a role, and also the environment. So what kind of environment are you in? Are you in a stressful environment? Are you eating well? What kind of other stressors are in the environment, right? So these are all the factors that come into basically the susceptibility of the person and how the disease is going to manifest. So sometimes if these variables are very different, it can be hard to pinpoint like one causative agent for the disease. So you need to do some controlled experiments, right? Normally these are animal experiments, and unethical to do experiments on people. But they sometimes will have to do that in order to eliminate other possible causes of the disease. And the question here was, right, who was the first person to develop the system of our etiology of diseases? And that was Koch's postulates, right? So again, we looked at how Koch's postulates has issues with it, right? Different issues with that postulate, but he did try to figure it out, right? How to the cause of a disease. Okay, the institutions that we have that are going to survey the planet and locally are public health institutions, the CDC and the HHS. So the CDC is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It is in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's basically an agency of the government Department of Health and Human Services. I'll probably date this by mentioning this, but the administration now is really undermining and preventing the CDC from doing its job because the head of the Department of Health and Human Sciences is sort of not very science-minded or public health-minded. Anyhow, but these areas are kind of getting hit with people getting fired, and hopefully, it won't kneecap our surveillance of the diseases worldwide. But it's very concerning for scientists to have this kind of being led by someone who is a conspiracy theorist a little bit. But what they do is these government agencies, they'll work with regional and state, smaller territorial public health departments. So every city will have a public health department, and they work with them to keep track of like locally what's happening to the people there. Are there any new or emerging diseases? Are there an uptick in a certain disease? So they would all report to the CDC. So the CDC can aggregate the data, right, and produce a look at like what's happening, right, a snapshot of what's happening in public health. And they don't look at everything, right? You're not going to report a cold, but there are diseases that are considered notifiable. Another way of saying that is reportable. I know that HIV, measles is definitely something of concern right now, right, in the news. West Nile, Shigella, like certain kinds of food poisoning are reportable. So if it's a reportable disease, that means that if you go to the doctor for it and you have measles, they need to report it to their public health department, and that public health department would then report it to the CDC. So how the CDC would disseminate the information is they publish a weekly morbidity and mortality weekly, fun reading, right? And it just provides people in the health field, physicians and healthcare workers, updates on the public health issues and tell them like if there's any changing with what notified diseases there are. Maybe we need to start looking at more let's say whooping cough, that has gone up in recent years. So that's how they disseminate the information. They do have a weekly I would say paper, but it's probably an email to these places that then can be more on the ground and work with the patients. Next up is reservoirs. So this is, where are these microbes in the world if they're not causing illness, right? So where do they reside? And they can be in living animals or people, living reservoirs. And these reservoirs can also be in non-living areas of the world. So something called carriers, right? So a person who is a carrier is going to somehow pass on the disease. And there's three ways. An active carrier is someone who's sick and they give it to you, right? So someone who has a flu, they cough in your presence and now you have the flu. So that's active carrier. A passive carrier is someone who doesn't know that they're carrying the disease on their body. So this is more of a person going from one patient to another patient to another patient, and somewhere along the way, they pick up a germ from one patient and they passively, unwittingly, pass it on to someone else. This can be, with like not washing hands, things like that. You can have then the third is asymptomatic carriers, which they don't know that they have the agent. Like they don't know they're carrying the bacteria. They don't know they're carrying a virus because they do not have any symptoms. And there are lots of asymptomatic carriers. I'll mention that sexually transmitted infections, chlamydia, gonorrhea, sometimes there's no symptoms in people. They have the bacteria. So Neisseria gonorrhea, for example, that's a bacterial infection, and they have it as part of the normal flora. They don't get sick. They do not have symptoms of gonorrhea, but they can pass it on to other people who may get symptoms from it. So that's an asymptomatic carrier. For animals, right? So those are called zoonotic diseases, and animals can be carriers of lots of different diseases. Rabies, for example, right? Animals have the rabies virus. It's not normally in the human population. Humans get it as a mistake, right? Or the animal bites them and transmit it. But normally it's an animal disease. So living reservoirs are people and animals that can pass on the disease. And then non-living. So if an agent is found in water, we can think about Vibrio cholera. Cholera is that disease we looked at with the cholera cots. It's found normally just in the water system, and there's nothing you really do about it except for make sure you're drinking processed water, clean water. It can be fresh water or seawater. Soil is a big reservoir. You can have lots of fungal spores in there, lots of spore-forming bacteria in there. Anthrax being one of them, Bacillus anthracis. Fomites. We looked at fomites before. So fomites are those contaminated objects that you can pass on from person to person. It's non-living. They just kind of are found there. And then food is another big one. Food contamination. There are some, so food and soil and water are very closely linked because food gets contaminated a lot of times from the soil, or food is contaminated from the water source. But food is another non-living reservoir where you can find pathogens. So if you think about eggs or chicken, chicken, that would be an animal, but eggs can carry salmonella, right? And that's not the fault of soil or water. It's just the fact that salmonella, it lives normally in the guts of reptiles and also our poultry. And salmonella can just naturally exist in the food, which is why you want to make sure your eggs are cooked and that your chicken is also cooked, or any poultry is cooked fairly well. So the salmonella, if there is any within the food, is killed. Transmission of disease, right? So we have direct contact, we have indirect contact, and we have vectors. Direct contact is, we know, physical contact. So any of these, touching, kissing, sexual contact. Droplet transmission is considered direct because this is basically close communication. So you can be talking, laughing, singing, sneezing, coughing, any of that's very close person-to-person transmission. So those are the two kinds of direct contact. Indirectly, right? So not close person-to-person, but we can get infected from fomites and from vehicles. And vehicles is basically food and water. Okay, so we can say food, right? Indirect contact, food or water are big vehicles for indirect transmission. And vectors. Vectors are bugs, usually bugs, insects that can transmit an infection to you with a bite or with just like carrying it on their body. So we'll talk about that in a second. This is a great video. I just want to see if this will work. This is an ad from the Australian, the Australians to promote getting the flu vaccine. Okay. Hope that made everybody want to use a napkin or a tissue when you sneeze.